One introduction Rosep view the United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building, for just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove, and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. Rosep view purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to residents against wood smoke emission particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents against wood smoke emission particulates, or ROSEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this ROSEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning, and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025, and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives, and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Webisode 57DHXYY, October 30th, 2025 KC, means nominee for Surgeon General hates medicine. In Webisode 57DHXYY, A Helm A novel about wind over centuries, 1B The Breath of the Gods, a book about wind, 2 Injustice, a nonfiction book about the Department of Justice under Biden and Trump, 3 The American Revolution, by Geoffrey C. Ward, and Ken Burns' book released November 11th, 2025. The book is an illustrated companion to their new TV series, 4 Stephen Hatfill COVID. Vaccine Critic is ousted from HHS, 5 across the country, wildfire fighters work for. Weeks at a time in poisonous smoke, 6 The hidden victims of American wildfires, 7 Why the price of electricity is spiking around the country, not all states have gotten hit equally hard, the reasons are complex. 8 Headlines main content. 1 A Helm A novel about wind over centuries, released November 4th, 2025. Review excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Book review October 29th, 2025. Helm A novel, United Kingdom, England. The writing of Sarah Hall has conquered the body and the soul, and now it conquers the wind itself, a literary masterpiece that explores faith, connection, and our relationship to the natural world. Helm is a ferocious, mischievous wind, a subject of folklore, an awe, part elemental god, part aerial demon, blasting through the sublime landscape of northern England since the dawn of time. Through the stories of those who have obsessed over Helm, an extraordinary history is formed. The Neolithic tribe who tried to placate Helm, the Dark Age wizard priest who wanted to banish Helm, the Victorian steam engineer who attempted to capture Helm, and the daughter of a farmer who fiercely loved Helm, but now a woman doctor surrounded by infinite clouds and measuring instruments in her observation hut, fears human pollution is killing Helm. Rich, wild, and vital Helm is the story of a singular life force and of the relationship between nature and people, neither of whom can weather life without the other. 1B The Breath of the Gods, a book about wind by Simon Winchester. Book released November 18th, 2025. Review excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Book review October 29th, 2025. A prolific and best-selling popular historian turns his attention to the wind, that most powerful of forces. With his signature entertaining erudition, he explores a subject that has quite literally powered the human world since our inception. 2 Injustice by Carol Leonig and Aaron C. Davis, a nonfiction book released November 4th, 2025. 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists tell the behind-the-scenes story of the Department of Justice under Presidents Trump and Biden. One attorney general makes trouble for the chief executive, and the other takes orders from the White House. Read on to find out which is which. 3 The American Revolution by Geoffrey C. Ward and Ken Burns. Book released November 11th, 2025. Review excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, an illustrated companion to their new series on the American battle for independence from the British. It is a story of blood and politics that brought soldiers and guns from around the world to fight along the eastern seaboard. 4 Stephen Hatfill COVID. Vaccine Critic is ousted from HHS. Dr. Hatfill said he was pushed out by the Chief of Staff of Health Secretary RFK Jr., who fired him when he refused to resign. Stephen J. Hatfill was a senior advisor at the Department of Health and Human Services. Rozap view good news for people who want access to the COVID-19 vaccine. Excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, October 28th, 2025. Stephen J. Hatfill, a biosecurity expert whose views helped form the basis for the decision of RFK Jr. to cancel funding for mRNA vaccine research, was fired over the weekend from his job. He said he was ousted as part of a coup to overthrow RFK Jr. that he claimed was being organized by Matt Buckham, the RFK Jr. Chief of Staff, but Hatfill did not explain why his ouster was evidence of the effort. Dr. Hatfill said that Buckham had told him that RFK Jr. wanted to go in a different direction and had asked him to resign. Dr. Hatfill, a one-time Army biodefense researcher, gained national attention more than 2 decades ago when he was wrongly accused of being involved in the 2001 anthrax attacks. He was brought into the Department of Health and Human Services earlier this year to serve the Assistant Secretary, responsible for preventing and responding to biological threats, including pandemics and bioterror attacks. Dr. Hatfill has long complained that the COVID-19 vaccines, some of which relied on mRNA technology, were rushed into production. He served as a medical and scientific advisor to the White House during the first Trump administration. During that time, he promoted the use of hydroxychloroquine, a drug against malaria, as a treatment for COVID despite warnings from the Food and Drug Administration against it. He said in an interview at the time that he had taken the drug while in Africa. Hatfield said the protest against RFK Jr. among some of the RFK Jr. advisors had been breeding for some time. Dr. Hatfill has long been a contentious figure. In a recent appearance on the Steve Bannon podcast, he asserted without evidence that it was more dangerous to take a vaccine than it was to contract COVID-19 and be hospitalized with it. He also said the accumulated data justified the RFK Jr. decision to cancel $500 million in contracts for mRNA vaccine research and development. 5 across the country, wildfire fighters work for weeks at a time in poisonous smoke. The government says they are protected. We tested the air at one fire to find out why they are still dying 12 hours in the smoke. Excerpts edited by Rozap for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, October 28th, 2025. It is July, and the green fire is tearing through Northern California. An elite federal firefighting crew called the La Grande Hotshots has been sent to help. The 24-person crew has been working for days on the front lines where invisible toxins hide in the thick haze. More than 1,000 firefighters are on the fire. The crew knows that they are risking their health. A group of firefighters wearing helmets and other gear. The La Grande Hotshots on assignment this summer. La Grande Hotshots 1 longtime member died last year after being diagnosed at 40 with Brain cancer. A former crew leader is being treated for both leukemia and lymphoma, diagnosed in his 40s. Another colleague was recently told that he has the lungs of a lifelong chain smoker. Wildfire fighters nationwide are getting sick and dying at young ages. The federal government acknowledges that the job is linked to lung disease, heart damage, and more than a dozen kinds of cancer to find out how harmful the air gets on an average. Size. Wildfire reporters brought sensors to the Green Fire this summer. We tracked levels of some of the most lethal particles in the air called PM 2.5, which are so tiny that they can enter the bloodstream and cause lasting damage. Readings above 225.5 micrograms per cubic meter are considered hazardous. On the fire line, levels regularly exceeded 500. Visibility was good, and the air did not smell smoky, but our monitors showed readings well into hazardous levels. Around 6 p.m., the La Grande hotshots started their shift and set off toward the fire line. A captain who is a crew leader assumed the air was reasonably safe. He has done this work for nearly 2 decades, and like most firefighters, he often has coughing fits after long shifts, but he believes that exposure to hazardous air is unavoidable. That is just the harsh truth, he said later. As climate change makes fire seasons worse, several states have tried to shield outdoor workers from wildfire smoke, which can contain poisons like arsenic, benzene, and lead. California now requires employers to monitor air quality during fires and to provide breaks and masks when the air turns unhealthy, but these rules do not apply on the wildfires themselves because state agencies and private companies successfully argued that those constraints would get in the way of fighting fires. Until recently, federal firefighters were not even allowed to wear masks on the job. Masks are now provided, but they are still banned during the most arduous work closest to the fire. The Forest Service says face coverings could cause heat stroke, though wildland firefighters in other countries regularly use masks without this problem. 827 micrograms per cubic meter at 9:48 p.m. As crews descended the ridge toward the fire line, the levels of toxic particles nearly doubled. Firefighters say that during their shifts, they worry more about immediate dangers, falling trees, burns, and sharp tools than about smoke exposure. As the La Grande crew hiked down the steep terrain, a woman squad leader concentrated on keeping her footing back home in the off-season. She sometimes wonders what the smoke is doing to her body. She said in an interview, "Maybe I will realize one day I should not have been doing this work." 10 a.m. 678 micrograms per cubic meter, 819 micrograms per cubic meter, 126 m 683 micrograms per cubic meter, 543 micrograms per cubic meter. The La Grande crew has been working in heavy smoke for hours now. They spray water to make sure the fire does not reach the treetops where it cannot be contained. Tears stream down the faces of firefighters, and their noses run as they work. The crew will continue until 7 a.m. The firefighters believe that the decision to work at night has paid off. The smoke occasionally got thick, but did not seem bad compared with other fires they have worked. They think the exposure was fleeting. In fact, the monitors show the air was never safe to measure particulate concentrations at the Green Fire. The Times followed U.S. Forest Service crews and carried 2 Atmo 2 Pro sensors. These portable, inexpensive monitors are the same as those the Forest Service has tested in the field. Atmo 2 Pro sensors demonstrated good performance for measuring fine particulate matter concentrations despite being a fraction of the size of reference grade models. On the Green Fire, the sensors recorded minute-by-minute averages of airborne particles that are 2.5 micrometers in diameter or smaller. The Times then matched these readings with timestamps and locations from a satellite-enabled GPS watch. Generally, the harm associated with PM 2.5 levels is calculated based on a 24-hour average. Here, for near real-time monitoring on the fire line, we followed guidance by first averaging the readings from the 2 sensors and then calculating a 15-minute rolling average. Using those figures, we categorized the health risks of PM 2.5 exposure according to standards set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We used standards meant for the public because there are no federal occupational standards for wildfire smoke exposure. After averaging, our data had a correlation coefficient of 0.98 and a mean coefficient of variation between the 2 sensors of 7.5%. The EPA recommends that PM 2.5 air measurements have a correlation coefficient of at least 0.7 and a mean coefficient of variation less than 30%. Our correlation and variance measures gave us confidence that the sensors were largely in agreement. The 3D base map in this article uses the Google photorealistic 3D tiles, which draw from the following sources to create the tiles: Google, Airbus, Landsat, Copernicus Data, SDO, NOAA, U.S. Navy, NGA, JEPCO, IBCO. 6. The hidden victims of American wildfires. The story of one young man who started fighting wildfires as a teenager and was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer on the eve of his 25th birthday. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, October 28, 2025. As wildfire seasons grow longer and deadlier, states are increasingly relying on private companies to provide thousands of firefighters to the front lines. I could not help but notice that there were all of these firefighters out there standing in what looked like the most toxic black smoke, and none of them were wearing masks. And it got me wondering, why is that? And what might be the consequences of working in that kind of environment with no protection? And so I started digging into the industry of people who fight wildfires, and what I discovered is that it is completely unlike any industry. They are out there in these really hazardous conditions, and they work without protection, and a lot of them are getting very sick at young ages. And when they develop things like severe lung damage or cancer, things that are linked to this smoke exposure, they are often on their own. Often they do not even have basic health insurance. It really strikes me that there will always be a Joel. There will always be people who need this kind of work, who want to do this kind of work, and an industry that needs Joels, right? There are tens of thousands of wildland firefighters, and as wildfire season grows longer and the fires grow more intense, the government is increasingly turning to firefighters like Joel. And people get into this work young, they really want to do it. And when they get sick, the industry just sort of moves on, and there is always going to be another young person to come and replace them. Not long after Hannah published the first story in this investigative series, Congress held oversight hearings citing her reporting and pressured the agency to make changes, and soon after it did, reversing its decades-long ban on masks and announcing it will provide masks to all of its firefighters and encourage them to use them. No plans have been announced to extend worker compensation coverage to contract firefighters. 7. Why the price of electricity is spiking around the country. Not all states have gotten hit equally hard. The reasons are complex. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity. In relationship to residents against with smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, The New York Times, October 30th, 2025. Millions of Americans have watched with dismay as their electricity bills have spiraled upward over the past few years. The rising price of power is squeezing households and businesses, and voter fury over higher costs is jolting elections in New Jersey, Virginia, and Georgia. Trump, who as a candidate promised to cut electric bills in half within 18 months, has blamed wind and solar power for soaring costs. Democrats say the problem is the Trump throttling of renewable energy, while others point to the rapid spread of energy-hungry data centers. But the factors driving electricity rates are often more complicated and depend on where you live. According to a comprehensive new study by researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, not all states are suffering equally. Over the past 6 years, the average retail price of electricity has risen faster than inflation in 26 states, but rates have stayed flat or even declined in the rest of the country. In real terms, that is, they have grown more slowly than overall inflation. Note prices are for residential electricity inflation adjusted to August 2025. Source: U.S. Energy Information Administration. Many states that have seen a major expansion of wind and solar power, like Nevada or North Dakota, have seen prices stay flat or decline, although there are some important exceptions to this rule. California is a leader in renewable energy, but has seen some of the largest electricity rate increases in the country, in part because devastating wildfires have imposed steep costs on utilities, which often get passed on to households. In the Northeast, states have struggled with high natural gas prices. There are so many different factors that can drive up electricity prices depending on where you live. It is a more nuanced story than what you often see in the headlines. Inflation is part of the story. The simplest factor behind surging power prices is inflation. Since 2021, as a result of post-pandemic disruptions, virtually everything has gotten significantly more expensive: food, cars, lumber, equipment, labor. For the most part, the increase in electricity rates nationwide has been in line with overall inflation, although there has been a noticeable acceleration this year. National averages can obscure a lot, though, and many states have seen electricity rates rise even faster than inflation, suggesting that there is more to the story. In California, average retail prices have risen by a staggering 34% since 2019, even after adjusting for inflation. In New Jersey, prices jumped 11% in the past year. In states like Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, prices are rising significantly faster than inflation. Several states that are not especially windy and sunny have required utilities to buy more electricity from large-scale wind or solar farms, such as Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New York. These requirements, which are often adopted to lower greenhouse gas emissions, can add a noticeable surcharge to bills. Many states, including California, Maine, and Massachusetts, have also offered incentives for homeowners to install rooftop solar panels. These policies can raise prices for other customers because solar households pay less to the utility but still rely on it for backup power that shifts the cost of maintaining the grid to other households. Utilities say solar proponents disagree, saying that this argument ignores many benefits of rooftop panels, such as avoided transmission costs. Rooftop solar policies accounted for roughly 1/4 of the increase in retail electricity prices in Maine and California since 2019. More recently, California and some other states have begun paring back their home solar incentives, yet rising power prices are in turn pushing more people toward rooftop solar to lower their bills. A California man spent around $65,000 this year on solar panels and batteries for his new home in Los Altos Hills, California. Solar was not part of the plan of the California man when he bought the house, but then he saw his electricity bill, which topped $600 his first month there. If you are at the whims of prices of utility companies, it is really a bit nerve-wracking, he said. Gas spikes in data centers also matter. Other states have their own stories. Electricity is expensive in the Northeast because those states rely heavily on imported natural gas, and there are a limited number of pipelines into the region, making the fuel costly. In recent years, New York has blocked new pipelines and closed a nuclear power plant, which deepened the reliance of the state on gas. That left the Northeast vulnerable when gas prices skyrocketed in 2022 amid Russian invasion of Ukraine. In Maine and Massachusetts, retail prices shot up by more than 1/3 as a result of these spikes, which have only lately subsided in recent months. Many communities have become alarmed by the expansion of massive data centers for artificial intelligence, with some critics warning that these power-hungry facilities will increase electricity costs. And yet in Virginia, home to one of the largest concentrations of data centers in the world, electricity prices have mostly stayed flat over the past 6 years, adjusting for inflation. If anything, those data centers may have helped suppress prices by allowing utilities to spread the fixed costs of maintaining the grid among a larger set of customers. But the effects of a rapid data center expansion will not always be benign. Experts cautioned a lot depends on whether power companies can keep up with the enormous energy needs of new data centers, and whether tech companies or households bear the cost of any needed grid upgrades. More ominously, wholesale electric capacity prices have been skyrocketing this year. In PJM Interconnection, the large regional grid that supplies Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and Virginia, some analyses have blamed those spikes on new data center demand, which are coming as older coal and nuclear plants are retiring, and the grid operator has been slow to connect new renewable and gas plants to replace them. Part of the problem is that you can often build new data centers faster than you can build new power plants to supply them, and that bottleneck can really drive up costs in the short term. Will prices keep rising? The average price of electricity has been rising faster than inflation this year, and government forecasters expect that will continue next year, especially since natural gas prices are starting to climb upward. Politicians are often struggling for answers. Trump administration officials say the solution is to drill more natural gas and build more pipelines to get that gas where it is needed, yet the administration is also trying to make it more difficult and expensive to build new wind and solar projects while canceling federal grants for grid upgrades aimed at lowering costs. While it will take time for the full impact of those restrictions to be felt, experts say they are expected to put upward pressure on electricity prices later this decade. Some states are exploring ways to blunt price shocks by requiring tech companies to absorb more of the cost of adding new data centers, or encouraging those data centers to operate more flexibly so that they limit the strain on the Grid others are considering technological options that could cut costs, such as deploying more batteries. The problem is pressing. More than 24% of households were unable to pay their energy bills in full in 2024, according to Census Bureau data, up from 20% in 2021. It is a perfect storm of misery for low and middle income households, said the executive director of the National Energy Assistance Directors Association. Headlines: The New York Times, October 30th, 2025. Arizona downtown Phoenix expanding upward. The New York Times. Casey means RFK Jr. nominee for Surgeon General opinion. The doctor who hates medicine. The New York Times. Climate disasters. United Nations UN climate adaptation report shows declining money for climate disasters. The New York Times. Comedy late night shade South Korea for giving Trump a crown. The New York Times. Computer chips. Nvidia is first company to top $5 trillion in market value amid AI boom. The New York Times. Consumers. Candy companies are quietly cutting down on cocoa to save money. The New York Times. Consumers. Coffee shop Starbucks reports a modest sales increase in latest quarter. The New York Times. Consumers. Recipes. Food healthy homemade snacks, tips, and recipes. The New York Times. Consumers. Travel. Anti-tourism tours show visitors a different side of vacation hotspots. The New York Times. Environmental win. Judge cuts Greenpeace Dakota Access Pipeline Award in half. The New York Times. Human interest. My good friend does not let me get a word in edgewise help. The New York Times. Humor. Lamp Club, a Luddite group, has come to free the iPad babies. The New York Times. Illinois Supreme Court asks for more info in Trump request to deploy National Guard in Chicago. The New York Times. Illinois Trump lawsuits. Illinois man charged with threatening Trump on social media. The New York Times. Michigan Detroit Cadillac in a leap of faith for its first F1 car designed. The Athletic. Nature life lessons from very old bowhead whales. The New York Times. Nature, why spiders are the ultimate interior decorators. The New York Times. Negative press. Corinne Jean-Pierre in a book tour. Most authors would not dream of the New York Times. New York City burglars in disguise. Millions in jewels taken, but this was in Queens. The New York Times. New York City. New York survived its 1975 crisis. Will Trump push it back to the brink? The New York Times. New York City Marathon Sunday, November 2nd, 2025. Stormy weather in New York City expected to clear ahead of the marathon. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race Tuesday, November 4th, 2025. Bloomberg gives $1.5 million to pro-Cuomo super PAC. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lack of interest in science and medicine. Casey means hates medicine but has an MD degree. Casey means Surgeon General nominee to face Senate hearing. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lack of interest in science and medicine and confidentiality. Judge rebukes Justice Department over efforts to obtain confidential patient details. The New York Times. Shut down. More Americans may soon feel the shutdown effects. The New York Times. Shutdown opinion. There are so many ways to shut down a country. The New York Times. Tennessee Trump Kirk fallout. Tennessee man released after month in jail over Kirk post. The New York Times. Texas olden times revisited. Large fire at Texas cotton gin prompts evacuation order. The New York Times. Trump Biden Justice Department's opinion how Trump and Biden dismantled the Justice Department. The New York Times. Trump economy. A month without data muddles the economic picture. The New York Times. Trump economy. Why the price of electricity is spiking around the country. The New York Times. Trump ideas. The Trump search for eternity. Heaven? Maybe not, he says. Monuments. Absolutely. The New York Times. Trump Justice Department prosecutors who called January 6th attackers a mob of rioters are punished. The New York Times. Virginia moves closer to redistricting plan that would help Democrats. The New York Times. Costa Rica travel. Try these destinations to save money. The New York Times. Venezuela tracking U.S. military killings and boat attacks. The New York Times. Venezuela U.S. military kills 4 more people accused of smuggling drugs on boats. The New York Times. The Netherlands centrist party ties Dutch election as far-right party loses seats. The New York Times. France. Art Monet was reluctant. Venice seduced him. The New York Times. France. Crime. French police arrest 5 more in Louvre jewel heist investigation. The New York Times. France movie auction review. The gilded hustle of the art world. The New York Times. Germany in World War II attacked Britain. Nature. V-1 missiles once terrorized Britain. Now they are home to starfish. The New York Times. Ukraine. Pokrovsk street battles rage in Ukrainian city after Russian troops enter stronghold. The New York Times. Syria Iraqi transition brings new waves of displacement. The New York Times. China how she walked away from Trump trade talks looking stronger. The New York Times. China Trump and she ease off the trade war, but new nuclear threat brings a chill. The New York Times. China Trump and she hoping to ease trade war agree to 1-year truce. The New York Times. China Trump threatens to resume nuclear weapons testing minutes before she meeting. The New York Times. China-U.S. beef and Thousand Island dressing. The Trump food tour of Asia. The New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. October 29th, 2025. Air pollution from wood-burning wildfires. The hidden victims of American wildfires. The New York Times. Air pollution from wood-burning wildfires. Inside the poisonous smoke killing wildfire fighters at young ages. The New York Times. Aviation shutdown makes air travel system less safe. Air traffic controllers say. The New York Times. Arizona Trump Kirk fallout. A city council race in Arizona turns toxic over the Trumpist Kirk legacy. The New York Times. California Democrats jockey for House seats ahead of redistricting vote. The New York Times. California federal judge disqualifies Trump-backed prosecutor in Los Angeles. The New York Times. California. Newsom hires U.S. attorney fired by Trump. The New York Times. California redistricting. Gavin Newsom tells donors he has enough cash for California redistricting fight. The New York Times. California wood-burning wildfire threat could cause air pollution. Los Angeles soars to 97 degrees as Santa Ana winds raise fire risk. The New York Times. Comedian Stephen Colbert spots something in the Trump perfect MRI scan. The New York Times. Computer chips. Can a startup make computer chips cheaper than the giants of the industry? The New York Times. Consumers gardening essential rules from a champion of organic growing. The New York Times. Counterterrorism question. An official who accessed FBI files in the Kirk case drew pushback when Patel felt the official had overstepped. The New York Times. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The head of The National Counterterrorism Center examined FBI files in the past several weeks to investigate whether the man charged with assassinating Charlie Kirk had support from someone else, a foreign power, or another entity, according to multiple people with knowledge of the matter. The inquiry, by Joe Kent, the director of the Counterterrorism Center, alarmed Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, Patel, and other senior officials believe Kent was overstepping, treading on FBI responsibilities, and potentially interfering with the investigation and the prosecution of the suspect Tyler Robinson. But supporters of Kent say he was doing his job, running down leads and making sure no foreign or domestic groups were linked to the death of Kirk. A Google Cardboard virtual reality viewer included in paper edition of NYT, The New York Times. From a new point of view, the New York Times Internet. OpenAI restructures as for profit company. The New York Times Internet being indifferent to food. Skinny influencers today are selling something more mind-bending than weight loss. The New York Times. Maine, New York City mayoral race, how a small elite college in Maine influenced the Mamdani worldview. The New York Times. Medicine and science, when caregiving makes women ill. The New York Times. Nature. Scuba diving. To get the story, a land-loving journalist had to dive deep. The New York Times. New Jersey Democrat Mikey Sherrill, a fan of ruthless competence. She wants to be governor of New Jersey. The New York Times. New Jersey Republican in third run for governor. Jack Ciattarelli mixes MAGA into his agenda. The New York Times. New Mexico nuclear arms. In a looming nuclear arms race, aging Los Alamos faces a major test. The New York Times. New York City. QR codes added to playbills. A Broadway tradition is fluttering into history. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race, Hochul mispronounces Mamdani name. At Mamdani rally, a moment of unity goes sideways for Hochul. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race, should the mayor control NYC schools? Mamdani and Cuomo do not agree. The New York Times. Oregon nature, a river restoration in Oregon gets fast results. The salmon swam right back. The New York Times. Philanthropist not recognizing the severity of climate change, memo from Bill Gates warns against climate alarmism. The New York Times. Philanthropy recognizing the severity of climate change, McKinsey. Scott backs disaster recovery in marginalized communities. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lacking science and medicine knowledge. Good news for people who want access to the COVID-19 vaccine. Stephen Hatfill, COVID vaccine critic, is ousted from HHS. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lack of science and medicine knowledge. It is not true that some sugars are less bad than others. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lacking medicine and science. Whole Foods Maha and the battle over healthy eating in America. The New York Times. Science and medicine patient put back on dialysis waiting for human kidney again. Pig kidney removed from transplant patient after 9 months. The New York Times. Science and medicine opinion, scientists need to take headaches seriously. The New York Times. Science and medicine, these silicone scar cover sheets help me find peace. Post-surgery reviews by Wirecutter. Shutdown, government shutdown imperils SNAP and other anti-poverty programs. The New York Times. Shutdown union of federal workers. The federal union demand to end shutdown fails to sway Democrats. The New York Times. TV Paramount to lay off 2,000 employees. The New York Times. Texas. RFK Jr. lacking science and medicine knowledge. Texas sues Tylenol makers claiming they hid autism risks. The New York Times. Trump actions, opinion, the empty promises of the Trump imperial presidency. The New York Times. Trump budget cuts to fund tax breaks for the rich. Trump officials in charge of food stamps leave their posts. The New York Times. Trump economy, delayed data. The Fed policy path looks more treacherous as shutdown delays critical data. The New York Times. Trump economy, opinion, the next economic bubble is here. The New York Times. Trump economy, the mixed picture of U.S. manufacturing in 4 charts. The New York Times. Trump economy, what to watch at the October meeting of the Federal Reserve. The New York Times. Trump Federal Communications Commission FCC changes course on the price of prisoner phone calls. The New York Times. Trump and journalism, when this reporter comes calling the White House insults go flying. The New York Times. Trump justice U.S. accuses TikTok user of threatening Pam Bondi. The New York Times. Trump Kirk fallout after the Kirk death. Brillen Hollyhan steps into the ring. The New York Times. Trump military how and where the National Guard has deployed to U.S. cities. The New York Times. Trump military radiation fears bring Maha and MAGA movements into conflict. The New York Times. Trump vice and Trump suggests he knows he cannot run again. It is too bad. The New York Times. Utah. Trump vision in Utah. The Trump vision for homelessness begins to take shape. The New York Times. Canada as Trump tariffs. Canada Carney turns to Asia for trade. The New York Times. Canada opinion, the Canadians are right about Reagan and free trade. The New York Times. Brazil. Trump tariffs ended. Trump tariffs seem to be enacted for personal Trump reasons. Senate votes to end the Trump Brazil tariffs with some GOP backing. The New York Times. Colombia. The Trump feud with Colombian leader threatens U.S. anti-drug efforts. The New York Times. Venezuela, a timeline of the Trump strikes on vessels he says are smuggling drugs. The New York Times. United Kingdom. Britain plans to convert 2 military bases to house asylum seekers. The New York Times. The Netherlands as the Dutch vote one issue carries the day. Affordable housing. The New York Times. Germany. Mercedes reports a drop in profit but maintains forecast. The New York Times. Italy on a terrace in Milan, a gathering of creative expats. The New York Times. Kuwait. The Trump pick for ambassador to Kuwait on path to failure. The New York Times. United Arab Emirates beyond the Dubai glitter. The UAE coast offers a glimpse of life before oil. The New York Times. India. The top 10 architectural sites to see in Mumbai. The New York Times. Sudan military withdraws from El Fasher in Darfur, handing city to RSF. The New York Times. China ahead of Trump Xi meeting. China doubles down on tech ambitions. The New York Times. China, how the opium war still shapes the trade clash of Xi Jinping with Trump. The New York Times. China. Trump administration backs plan for new nuclear plants. The New York Times. Japan deals with the price of playing to Trump $550 billion. The New York Times. Japan plans to send troops to help stop bear attacks. The New York Times. Japan. Toyota says $10 billion U.S. investment touted by Trump is not new. The New York Times. Malaysia, a furniture town reels from the Trump tariffs and braces for more. The New York Times. North Korea conducts missile test ahead of Trump visit to South. The New York Times. South Korea. Jeonju scrambles to host Trump, Xi, and more leaders at APEC. The New York Times. South Korea. Trump meets the president of South Korea in Jeonju. Live updates. The New York Times. Taiwan Beyond trade war, Xi of China looks to press Trump on Taiwan. The New York Times. Vietnam prevents BBC journalist from leaving the country. The New York Times. Asia Radio Free Asia will halt news operations amid shutdown. The New York Times headlines. The Guardian. October 30th, 2025. Consumers' Halloween candy prices rising, spooked by the Trump tariffs and climate change. Trump tariffs. The Guardian. Illinois. Democratic contender for Congress indicted over Chicago ICE protests. Illinois. The Guardian. Minnesota. The Mamdani of Minneapolis is banking on a grassroots campaign to unseat the Democratic mayor. Minneapolis. The Guardian. Politicians. Extremists exploit political trigger events to recruit people online, says study U.S. politics. The Guardian. Shutdown. Trump is using the shutdown to make life tougher for millions of workers. Stephen Greenhouse. The Guardian. Shutdown. U.S. could lose between $7 billion and $14 billion during shutdown. Budget office says U.S. federal government shutdown 2025. The Guardian. Trump justice. The Trump absurd Department of Justice compensation bid would be rejected if he were anyone else. Experts say Trump. The Guardian. Trump justice. Trump news at a glance. Trump effort to sue his own Department of Justice is absurd and frivolous. Expert says Trump administration. The Guardian. Trump Bison. The Trump blithe dismissal of climate science. Trump. The Guardian. Australia. Grieving daughter of cruise ship passenger left behind on remote Australian island says there was a failure of care. Queensland. The Guardian. United Kingdom. Can I learn to be cool even though I am garrulous and wear no-show socks? Life and style. The Guardian. United Kingdom slang. Terms like 6-7 have no definition, but they are loaded with meaning. Matthew Cantor. The Guardian. The Netherlands. Dutch election results. Far-right and centrist parties in dead heat as last votes counted. Europe. Live. France. 5 new suspects arrested in connection with Louvre robbery. Paris. The Guardian. Germany. German dentists hold memorial recognizing sadistic practices of profession under Nazis. Germany. The Guardian. Ukraine. Russian army chiefs torturing and executing soldiers who refuse to fight in Ukraine. Report says Russia. The Guardian. Ukraine war briefing. Putin boasts of nuclear-driven torpedo that would swamp cities with radioactive tsunami. World News. The Guardian. Ukraine. Wives, mothers, fighters, activists. The millennial women keeping Ukraine going. Global development. The Guardian. India scamming became the new farming inside the India cybercrime villages. Cybercrime. The Guardian. China. 5 key takeaways from the Trump meeting with Xi Jinping. Trump. The Guardian. China. Trump directs Pentagon to match Russia and China in nuclear weapons testing. Trump. The Guardian. China. Trump. Xi meeting U.S. president says rare earths deal and tariff cut agreed. Trump. The Guardian. China. What are rare earths and critical minerals? Explained in 30 seconds. Mining. The Guardian headlines. The Guardian. October 29th, 2025. Air pollution from natural gas burning. All operational U.S. liquefied natural gas terminals have violated pollution limits, says report. U.S. News. The Guardian. Aviation shutdown. Air traffic controllers receive $0 paychecks as government shutdown stretches. U.S. federal government shutdown 2025. The Guardian. Climate change. Rising heat kills 1 person a minute worldwide. Major report reveals climate crisis. The Guardian. Medicine and science scans shed light on changes in brain when we zone out while tired. Neuroscience. The Guardian. Mississippi lab monkeys that escaped captivity in Mississippi are not carrying diseases. University says Mississippi. The Guardian. Movie. Nuclear war. Catherine Bigelow responds to Pentagon criticism of House of Dynamite. I just state the truth. Catherine Bigelow. The Guardian. New York City flooding and droughts drove them from their homes. Now they are seeking a safe haven in New York. Climate crisis. The Guardian. Ohio. J.D. Vance did nothing as Trump cuts costs. His Ohio hometown millions. Will it reshape the city council? Ohio. The Guardian. Ohio. Springfield. Haitians helped boost the Springfield economy. Now they are fleeing in fear of Trump. Ohio. The Guardian. Pennsylvania. Some of the earliest written notes in Western musical history discovered in Pennsylvania. The Guardian. Trump actions. Dear Trump, here is how you can win that Nobel Peace Prize. Mehdi Hassan. The Guardian. Trump budget cuts to fund tax breaks for the rich, including fossil fuel and wood-burning industries. Oxfam says the American super rich are running down the safe climate spaces of the planet. Greenhouse gas emissions. The Guardian. Trump ballroom. MSNBC host criticized owner Comcast for donating to Trump ballroom. MSNBC. The Guardian. Trump ballroom. The Trump ballroom blitz sparks chorus of disgust. The perfect symbol. Trump. The Guardian. Trump budget cuts to fund tax breaks for the rich. 24 states sue White House over food stamp suspension amid shutdown. U.S. federal government shutdown 2025. The Guardian. Trump budget cuts to fund tax breaks for the rich. Americans brace for food stamps to run out the greatest hunger catastrophe since the Great Depression. U.S. federal government shutdown 2025. The Guardian. Trump internet. Why the Trump White House is using video game memes to recruit for ICE games. The Guardian. Trump justice. Trump appointed acting U.S. attorney disqualified from cases for unlawfully serving rules. Judge law. U.S. The Guardian. Trump media from CBS to TikTok. U.S. media are falling to the Trump allies. This is how democracy crumbles. Owen Jones. The Guardian. Universities and colleges. Small U.S. college towns reel amid Trump immigration crackdown. They need international students. U.S. universities. The Guardian. Argentina, a colony of the U.S. Argentinians contemplate future after Trump-backed Milei coasts to victory. Argentina. The Guardian. Brazil. Environmentalist. Trump does not represent us. U.S. activist groups to push for climate action at COP30 in Brazil. COP30. The Guardian. United Kingdom. How a radical experiment to bring a forest into a preschool transform the health of children. Early years education. The Guardian. The Netherlands. As Netherlands goes to the polls again. Geert Wilders faces isolation. Netherlands. The Guardian. The Netherlands. Voting opens in Netherlands as narrowing polls suggest second. Geert Wilders win Netherlands. The Guardian. Italy. The Guardian. View on press freedom in Italy at a low ebb on the Georgia Meloni watch. Editorial. The Guardian. Serbia. After a year of student-led protests, the cracks in the Serbian government have turned into fissures. Srjan Kvijic. The Guardian. Ukraine in Russia. Moscow under drone siege for third night running. Ukraine. The Guardian. Ukraine. Russian drone attacks on civilians in Ukraine are war crimes. UN report concludes. Russia. The Guardian. Russia. Kremlin-linked operatives scramble to stop extradition of mercenary accused of plotting coup. Romania. The Guardian. South Korea. No Trump protests in South Korea as U.S. president finalizes trade deal with Lee Jae-myung. U.S. politics live.
Red-green fox here. The quick red-green fox jumped over the barriers to clean air. Red-green fox here. Ready to sing to you the the names of the 2025 major wood-burning biomass industry subsidy opponents. 1. Biofuel Watch. 2. Bulkley Valley Stewardship Coalition of British Columbia, Canada. 3. Kommite Schön Luft, which means Beautiful Air Committee in German. 4. Dogwood Alliance. 5. Equity Group Foundation, nicknamed EGF. 6. Environmental Paper Network, nicknamed EPN. 7. Natural Resources Defense Council, nicknamed NRDC. 8. Prakaunia naar Zexwisseskick Isted, which means Workshop for All Beings in Polish. 9. Rachel Carson Council. 10. Solutions for Our Climate, nicknamed SFOC.
Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here.
Hi, I am Leone. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American Heather Cox Richardson. Substack your local epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times.
One introduction. Rosette view. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom. The Eco-Design Wood Stove and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. Rosette view. Purple air. PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.